This is a special episode of the Automotive Leaders Podcast. It is 6 p.m. on Wednesday, April the 2nd in the Metro Detroit area, and we are just absorbing what happened with the Trump announcement on tariffs. And joining me to tear into this subject is Sig Huber. Sig is the Chief Commercial Officer at Elm Analytics with a deep history working for both OEMs and suppliers in our beloved auto industry. Sig, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, and happy Liberation Day.
Liberation Day or Termination Day, as the Canadians would say, right? But Let's start off, Sig, you have been through many crises and disruptions in your career. What does this feel like to you? What's your initial reaction?
I've always been a huge fan of the industry, and just as importantly, the resilience of the industry. Time and time again, even going back to COVID, before COVID, 9/11, the industry has proven itself to be surprisingly resilient to all of these types of storms that have come into play. And this is different because this is not a storm. It's a structural shift in the supply chains around the world.
Yeah, you're right. It's big. It has tentacles far-reaching around the globe. Typically, when we deal with a crisis in the industry, whether it's a semiconductor crisis or a paint supplier in Japan or some chemical, we can focus in on it, we can fix it and deal with it. But this has so many tentacles. Does it feel as bad as maybe the bankruptcy when you've gone through bankruptcies at OEMs, or does it feel even worse than that?
I would say it's comparable to the environment that was around in 2008 and 2009. I was at Chrysler at the time and part of the team that worked on taking the company through its bankruptcy process. And there was chaos there for quite a long time, but there was a path and there was a legal process to follow. And here we're in completely uncharted waters because we're in the process of restructuring global supply chains. And the uncertainty, I think, now is even greater than it was then. There, the uncertainty was, what's the legal process? Are companies going to get paid? And is there a path to the restructuring and getting out of it? Here, the problems that the industry has to deal with are massive. Because, as I said before, these are about structural changes, fundamental structural changes in the supply chain. And those are changes that cannot be made easily or quickly. And if you want to start resourcing parts to the US, there's probably not enough capacity to resource all of the parts that you would like to resource. And then you've got challenges with shortages of engineering resources and shortages of equipment and shortages of available property that's available to develop to build new facilities. There's just so many different arms and legs that are attached to this, and all of those things will take a lot of time to work their way through the process. And it's not going to happen overnight. And now we're facing these very significant input cost increases for the entire industry. And these increases, it's still unclear as to how they're going to be paid for. And to the extent that they're passed on to consumers via price increases, that's going to result in probably less volume. So according to a recent study by the Center of Automotive Research, just a $3,000 increase in vehicle prices, new vehicle prices, will result in 1.3 million fewer vehicles sold, which of course decreased volumes on top of the increased input costs is really going to put a financial strain on the entire industry.
Yeah, because it's pretty simple, right? If demand goes down because the prices are too high, then we're not going to produce as many cars, and then the OEMs are going to have to make some tough decisions like laying people off. And as we know, particularly in Michigan, there are so many jobs that are linked to the auto industry. So it's not just the car assembly plants that will feel the pain of the layoff. It's the entire supply chain and all the industries to support it.
Yeah, when companies look at establishing a new manufacturing plant, like an OEM looks at establishing a new manufacturing plant, there's more than 7 jobs created in the community for every job created at that OEM assembly plant. And so it's not just about, to your point, it's not just about the jobs at suppliers and the jobs at OEMs. There's all of the ancillary businesses that are either supporting the plant or just they're in the community, and the workers in those facilities are spending money in those businesses, right? Whether it's pizza shops or dry cleaners or grocery stores, all of those businesses are potentially going to be impacted by this.
Yes. Now, the UAW is very much in support of tariffs, and Sean Fain has come out and said there are plants in the U.S. that are underutilized, and we can add shifts into those plants. And I'm sure there's some truth to that, Sig, but probably not to the level that Trump is talking about.
Yeah, I think there is some open capacity. There's probably 20 or 30% of open capacity, but it's in pockets. There's where there's open capacity, and there's some pockets where there's no capacity. And all of that is going to have to get sorted out and figured out. The other thing that may happen is there's been capacity reserved for electric vehicle production. Volumes of those electric vehicles is not materializing at the rate that was initially thought. So maybe some of that capacity then gets converted back to more traditional ICE vehicles to create some additional capacity.
Yes, and in the announcement, President Trump implied that there was another announcement coming. There was a sense that there's a big auto plant investment coming. Sig, walk me through the timeline to actually put up a brand new auto plant. What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a really complicated process, and it starts with a site selection by the company. And as they go out and look for sites and they contact communities, one of the most important things is finding a piece of property that's suitable for a manufacturing plant. You don't want homes or schools nearby or other things where people could complain about noise and traffic, because there's a lot of congestion and traffic that is involved, for example, with an OEM assembly plant. You have not only the workers coming and going, but you've also got all the trucks delivering parts and taking the finished vehicles to their destinations. And it's not a type of environment that you want to be in a residential type of neighborhood. And so you have to find the property. And those properties aren't assembled in those communities. The communities have to go out and talk to landowners and assemble the parcels together to make a contiguous property that would be suitable. And then you're going to have to bring in infrastructure like roads, you're going to have to bring in rail, you're going to have to bring in natural gas and water and electricity. There's a lot of infrastructure that's required to support those plants. And all of that takes a lot of time. And then you've got permitting for water, for air, and others. And you're probably talking 4 to 5 years minimum from the time that an OEM has an idea to build a plant to the time that it's actually producing vehicles. It's a very long and complex process, an interesting process, great process for the communities that get these facilities, but it takes a long time. And it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen, in my view, during the term of President Trump's presidency.
So staying with the OEM perspective for a moment, what will the OEMs do with these tariffs? They've got to pass some of them on to the consumer, surely. What do you think?
Yeah, they're going to have to pass some on. The question is what's going to happen with the suppliers.
Yes.
Because the suppliers, and I've talked to a lot of the CEOs recently, they cannot handle the financial impact of these tariffs, even a little bit. And so what they're saying to their OEM customers is they're just not going to ship parts unless they get commitments that the full impact of the tariffs are going to be taken care of by the OEMs. And of course, if that happens, then you're going to have choppy production schedules because you're going to have some parts and sometimes you're not going to have parts. And so it's going to be a little bit like the early days in COVID when companies were trying to start up and it was a very choppy production. You're going to have the same types of things. And then the OEMs have a little bit of inventory on the lots right now. They've been pulling ahead vehicle production. But once those vehicles are sold in a month or so, then you're going to have situations where you've got the increased prices having to be passed on to consumers, which again can impact the demand of those vehicles.
Yes, and I'm also hearing that the tier ones are taking a strong stance with the OEMs.
Yeah.
The letters are in, the negotiations are already started, and this idea that some OEMs have where they've put out that, hey, just keep shipping to contract, that's not going to happen. They will stop shipping components. And like you say, that's going to cause massive disruption. And all of that really is going to unravel pretty quickly in the next few weeks, I would think.
I think so. Our company tracks financial data for both public and private automotive suppliers. And our current database shows that the supply base overall is not very strong. So this is hitting at a time when the supply base is not fully prepared financially to be able to handle it. Now, if you look at the current supply base, about 6% to 8% of the suppliers are what we would call rated red. If there's only a 5% increase in the cost of goods sold, we've done a sensitivity analysis. If there's only a 5% increase in cost of goods sold, it will more than double the number of suppliers that are red. It's really going to be a problem. And if you look at those suppliers that are red right now or borderline red, their return on sales is negative right now, meaning they're losing money right now on every sale they make. And if you start adding extra costs for their subcomponents and materials, they are very quickly going to run out of liquidity being able to afford to even produce the parts. So it's unfortunately not a great time for the supply base to have this hitting. Probably never would be a good time, but this is especially a time when the supply base is vulnerable. And it'll be a really good test of the resilience of the supply base that I talked about earlier. It's proven itself over and over again. But this is, as I said, this is a structural shift. This is beyond just a little storm or even a big storm that's coming their way. This is a structural shift, which is going to take a long time to sort itself out. And it's going to be very challenging for everyone in the industry.
Yeah, I was trying to think through an example in my mind of how this works. And we got this idea of tariff stacking, because it's not just one number. These tariffs stack on top of each other. So if you were maybe a small family-owned business in Michigan in the auto industry producing an assembly, maybe you stamp a few of those components, you have to buy some electronics, maybe some high-tech component from Germany. So you would have to pay, first of all, if you were getting the steel and aluminum from outside the country, so you got 25% tariff on that. Then let's say your electronics component came from China. So right now, as we know it, that's 34%. Then if you have a product from Germany, and that's subject to the EU tariff, which is 20%. So you add all of that up, there's no way a small company operating on slim margins or even no margin, to your point,
right,
in the industry right now can survive this. They have got to raise the flag now, today, tomorrow morning. They're not going to be able to bring product. If they don't have inventory already in their system in the pipeline, they cannot produce.
You're absolutely right. And where it's really going to be a problem is at the tier 2 level and the tier 1 level. That's where we're seeing the greatest chance of financial failure, unfortunately. I have spoken with several OEMs about this topic, and they are aware that the supply base is fragile right now. They just have to figure out how do they protect themselves at the same time making sure that the suppliers are also stable and able to continue to stay in business and produce parts.
Supply chain leaders at the tier 1 level, at the tier 2 level, one of the things that they've been grappling with lately is visibility into that supply chain. Because we all know it's not as easy as everybody thinks to go all the way down through the tiers in your supply chain and understand exactly where every product comes from. What is the country of origin? So there's that level of transparency that you need in the supply chain, but you also need to understand the financial stability of your suppliers as well. So if there's one benefit or one good thing coming out of this, Sig, it is putting a spotlight on the need to really know your supply chain, isn't it?
Yeah, Jen, that's a great point because right now companies know who they buy parts from directly, but they don't know who makes the subcomponent parts that go in that part or where those companies are located. It's a huge blind spot in the industry, and it's been that way for decades. And this is an opportunity for companies to finally get a handle on what their supply chain looks like down to tier N, or at least down to tier 3 or tier 4. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, whether or not suppliers are willing to provide that information, whether companies are willing to collaborate more closely in order to generate trust, because collaboration can only happen if there's trust on both sides of the relationship. And so that is going to have to be developed because it's inconsistent now. Some companies have trust with their supply base and some companies don't. And that is going to be imperative that companies starting at the OEM level are collaborating closely and are developing trust with their suppliers.
And we see this come out, Sig, when we look at the WRI results. And typically we see Toyota coming out at the top of the WRI, the rating for the relationships between the OEMs and the suppliers, how the suppliers see the OEM. So they tend to come out on top. And we've seen Stellantis struggle and Ford struggle at the bottom in the last survey. Of course, the new one is due to come out in May. We know that Toyota fared better than most in the chip crisis because of their relationships and some of the tactical moves that they made. So do you think that Toyota will come out ahead in this?
It's hard to say because this is a very complicated matter. And to the extent that there's parts being imported from Japan, they're going to be subject to those tariffs, which are 24%. And that's very expensive. Now, Toyota, I used to work at Toyota, and Toyota has been making an effort on localization of parts for a very long time, going back decades. They've been trying to localize as many parts as they can, but they still have exposure with parts coming from the APAC region. They also import a lot of vehicles still from the APAC region, and specifically from Japan. And so overall, Toyota is going to have some challenges because of this is a very complicated issue. Now, to the earlier point, their ability to collaborate and their trust, their mutual trust with suppliers is very high, along with Honda and a few of the other OEMs as well. And I think that definitely bodes well for their ability to manage this situation. But this is not going to be easy for anybody.
Sig, we're no stranger to challenges in the auto industry. We're a tough bunch, and we know how to handle these situations. But this one feels different. Why is this different?
So this is not just a storm that's going to blow over. This is a fundamental transformation of supply chains that's occurring. It's a structural shift in the industry. It's going to take a lot of time to work itself through, and there's a lot of different angles that are going to impact the industry, both suppliers and OEMs. So the one that everyone is, of course, talking about are the tariff impacts with respect to the costs. So you've got these immediate cost increases for materials and subcomponents, and all of those costs are going to have to be somehow shared or passed along to the ultimate customer in order for the industry to get through it. But it's not just about cost, because there's going to be implications on volume, right? There's going to be short-term implications on volume because as suppliers either stop shipping because they don't want to absorb the cost of the tariffs and they don't have an agreement with their customer, that's going to create very choppy production schedules like we had on the start of COVID. And that's going to create volume shortfalls, which are in turn going to aggravate the financial impacts of the tariffs. Then, a month or two into the future, as vehicle sales start to drop because vehicle prices have increased, then you're going to have more continued and long-lasting volume declines, which are going to, again, exaggerate the financial impacts of the tariffs from a cost and financial perspective. Then you've got questions around currency. What's going to happen to the US dollar? Is the US dollar going to get stronger? Initially, maybe, but once there's retaliation, which we'll probably find out about tomorrow, and other countries start retaliating, maybe the dollar starts to weaken after that. We don't know what's going to happen, but that's an unknown, which is complicated, and that will have a financial impact specifically on companies that have an international footprint. Then you've got issues with lenders. How are the lenders going to respond to this? Right now, there's been an environment over the past, I would say, 3 to 5 years, maybe since we came out of COVID, where lenders have been lenient. And when companies have violated their lending covenants, they've been willing to what they call amend and extend those agreements. Are those lenders now going to start looking at those covenant violations a lot more seriously and start shutting off working capital lines of credit when companies are out of compliance with their loan covenants? That's another shoe that may drop. And then you've got things like engineering shortages, right? So if you're going to have to resource a bunch of parts, and if you have to validate those parts, or redesign them, or move to alternative materials that aren't subject to tariff, there aren't enough engineering resources in the industry right now to be able to manage any of that workload, let alone a tsunami of everybody trying to do it for every part all at once. So there's so many different angles that make this a really complex problem that's not just a bankruptcy or some of the other things that we've dealt with over the past decades in the industry. This is really, in my view, unprecedented, at least in my lifetime, an unprecedented structural shift, which is going to challenge everybody in the industry to figure out how to get through it. And collaboration and building trust between the various pieces of the supply chain and the OEM customers is going to be vital for ensuring that the industry can get through this in the best possible manner.
To close this out on a positive note, listening to you talking about collaboration and trust, this is an opportunity for leaders in the auto industry to once and for all embrace collaboration and trust with their supply base. This could be it. This could be your moment to rise up to the challenge and really move the needle. And that's OEMs to tier 1s to tier 2s all the way through. It cannot be a situation where you turn around and send out a letter to all your supply base, a form letter that says, "Dear valued supplier, basically, we're not paying the tariffs, you got to eat it." This is not the time for that letter, right, Sig?
It's going to be a time when everyone needs to collaborate, and they're going to have to trust each other with information they're providing, and they're going to have to be as transparent as they can. It's the only way the industry is going to be able to adjust, because this is not just a storm that's going to pass. This is a structural shift, which is going to take many years to accomplish.
Yes, yes. And there it is. Collaboration, trust, and transparency is the way through this. Sig, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.